21-year-old man lies dying in a rented palace bedroom that is not his own, in a country that is not his father's, under a name that is not his birth name. He has spent his whole adult life being called Franz. His visitors call him Your Highness, Duke, sometimes Prince. Almost nobody in that room, on this morning of the 22nd of July, 1832, calls him what he was born to be called. King of Rome. He asks for poultices. He asks for blisters on his chest, as though there were still time for medicine to matter. Then he says nothing else, ever again. Now go back 17 years. A 100-cannon salute rolls over the rooftops of Paris. Every shot beyond the 21st means the child in the Tuileries Palace is a boy, and the guns keep firing past 21, past 40, all the way to 100, and the city erupts, because the emperor of the largest domain Europe has seen in 1,000 years finally has an heir. How does the son of the most powerful man on the continent end up dying, forgotten by his own government, coughing blood into a handkerchief inside the palace of the family that once made war on his father? In the next few minutes, you will discover what happened inside a locked drawer in a Viennese palace bedroom in 1831. You will learn what an Austrian chancellor said about a portrait he could not bear to look at. And you will hear the last complete sentence this young man ever composed about his own existence. A sentence so precise and so final that historians still quote it word for word 2 centuries later. What you are about to hear is not a story about an emperor's son. It is a story about what a country does to a boy it is afraid of. There is a uniform, cut for a child, sewn to resemble his father's, that a governess kept for years after it no longer fit him. Remember that uniform. It returns at the end of this video, in a place its owner never expected to end up. Stay with this one. It has not been told this way before. He was born on the 20th of March, 1811, inside the Tuileries Palace in Paris, and his birth nearly killed his mother. Marie-Louise of Austria, 20 years old, and the daughter of the very emperor whose armies Napoleon had beaten at Wagram 2 years earlier, laboured so long and so violently that the attending physicians reached a decision no one wanted to make out loud. If it came down to a choice, they would save the mother, not the child. Napoleon, waiting outside, gave his consent. The boy was pulled out with forceps, 9 pounds of him, and for several agonizing seconds he did not move and did not cry. Someone laid him, forgotten in the chaos, on a carpet. Then he stirred. He lived. The same day, still bloody from the birth canal, he was given a title larger than most men earn in a lifetime. King of Rome, heir to an empire that spanned from the Pyrenees to the Vistula. His father, a man not known for tenderness, reportedly wept. But look at what this child was born into, and look closer at what he was not given. He had a father who adored the idea of him more than he would ever have the chance to know the boy himself. Napoleon was, by every account, doting when he was present. He carried the infant on his back on all fours across the carpets of Saint-Cloud, let him crawl over state papers, called him the Little King. But Napoleon was, by nature and by profession, absent, at war, at council, at empire building. And the boy's first and formative bond was instead with his governess, Madame de Montesquieu, a woman devoted enough to spend a fortune assembling a private library to shape him, and stern enough to enforce a court schedule better suited to a general than a toddler. Here is the seed, sitting in plain sight, before anyone could have named it. This child's entire identity was assigned to him before he had done a single thing to earn or understand it. He was a king before he could walk. He was a symbol before he was a person. Everyone around him, his father, the court, The empire itself needed him to represent continuity, dynasty, permanence. Nobody yet knew how thoroughly that need would outlive the empire that created it, or how completely it would come to define and confine the boy underneath the title. The last time Napoleon saw his son with any normalcy was the 24th of January, 1814. The emperor kissed his wife and his not yet 3-year-old boy goodbye before riding out to defend a collapsing empire. He did not know it was the final ordinary embrace of his life. 10 weeks later, the ground beneath the boy's entire existence would give way, and he would be carried toward a country that had every reason to fear the name he carried. To understand what this child lost, you have to understand what was built around him in the first 3 years of his life, because for those 3 years, he was, on paper, the most secure heir in Europe. His father had already divorced a wife he loved, Josephine, specifically because she could not give him a son, and had married into one of the oldest ruling houses on the continent instead. Napoleon once put it with brutal clarity: he had married a womb. Marie-Louise, granddaughter of Marie Antoinette's own family line, arrived in France in 1810, trailing the legitimacy of the Habsburgs behind her like a wedding train. When she delivered a living, healthy son the following spring, Napoleon believed he had done what Julius Caesar and Alexander never managed. He had converted personal conquest into permanent inheritance. The boy was baptized in a ceremony at Notre Dame on the 9th of June 1811, modelled deliberately on the baptism of the last Bourbon Dauphin, a calculated message that Bonaparte legitimacy could borrow the same sacred theatre as 1,000 years of French kings. He was given 4 names: Napoleon François Charles Joseph, and titles that piled on top of one another: Prince Imperial by constitutional right, King of Rome by his father's personal decree, heir to duchies in Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla by treaty. Every part of the machinery of the First French Empire pointed at this child as its living guarantee of continuation. Napoleon himself said, of the string of victories and territory that had built the world this boy was born into, that a father founds an empire not for himself but to hand it on. Everything he had bled for at Austerlitz, at Wagram, across Italy and Egypt and the Rhine, existed now, in his mind, to flow into this single small body. Within 3 years, none of it would remain. That sentence is not foreshadowing for its own sake. It is a fact you need to sit with, because almost nobody alive in 1811 believed it. The empire looked, from the vantage point of that cannon salute in Paris, indestructible. It was not. Between the boy's birth and his 3rd birthday, his father would launch and lose an invasion of Russia so catastrophic it swallowed most of an army of over 400,000 men, and the coalition that had spent 2 decades failing to stop Napoleon would finally succeed. The boy's whole world, the palace, the guns, the title, the father who bounced him on his back across the carpet, was not a beginning. It was already, quietly, an ending. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about this boy. Almost everyone who controlled his life after the age of 3 had a private reason for wanting him kept exactly where they could watch him. When Napoleon abdicated for the first time on the 6th of April 1814 and was sent to Elba, his wife and son did not go with him. They went, instead, to Vienna, to Marie-Louise's own father, Emperor Francis I of Austria. On the surface, this looked like a mother taking her child home to safety. Underneath, it was the beginning of an arrangement that would define, and quietly cage, the rest of the boy's life. Francis was, by most accounts, genuinely fond of his grandson. But Francis also had a chancellor, Klemens von Metternich, who understood something the emperor perhaps did not fully articulate. A living son of Napoleon Bonaparte, was either the single greatest threat to the peace of Europe or the single greatest bargaining chip available to Austria, and possibly both at once. Metternich's solution was containment. The boy would be raised, educated, and eventually militarized entirely inside Austria, under constant, quiet observation, never permitted contact with the family or the country that had made him who he was. The evidence of this hidden control is not subtle once you go looking for it. He was denied even a single letter from his own 80-year-old, cataract-blind grandmother, Laetitia Bonaparte, Madame Mère, because Metternich would not permit correspondence with anyone who might reawaken the boy's sense of who his father had been. His name itself was quietly replaced. The child once saluted by cannon fire as Napoleon II was now called Franz, the German form of one of his other given names, as though the empire he was born to inherit could be edited out of him syllable by syllable. And yet, he could not be edited that easily. As he grew older, he began, on his own, seeking out what nobody in Vienna wanted him to find. He read Las Cases' Memorial of St. Helena, the account of his father's exile and captivity, obsessively, pulling it down from a high shelf in the palace library where it had likely been placed to be overlooked. He began dressing, in private, in a small version of his father's military uniform, drilling imaginary troops in the halls of Schönbrunn. He was, in effect, constructing a version of his father from fragments, in secret, inside the household of the very family that had defeated that father twice. His mother, meanwhile, had settled in her own Duchy of Parma, with her own new companion, a man named Adam von Neipperg, whom she had married and by whom she had already had children before that marriage was even public. She rarely visited her son. What the household around him did not fully reckon with was how much that absence and that surveillance would eventually cost him. On the 5th of May, 1821, on a volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, called St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte died at just past 5 in the afternoon, attended by a handful of loyal officers, a priest, and a doctor who would spend the rest of his life arguing about what killed him. The autopsy pointed to stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. His last words, according to those present, invoked France, the army, and the name Josephine, not the name of his living wife, and not the name of his 10-year-old son. In Vienna, the boy learned of his father's death the way almost everything about his father reached him, filtered, delayed, and stripped of context by the household around him. Marshal Marmont, who observed him closely in this period, and his tutor, Count Dietrichstein, both later described the same thing, a sensitive, volatile nature that broke open at the news. This was, by every surviving account, the first time the 10-year-old boy fully understood that the father he had built out of a smuggled memoir and a child's military uniform was gone, permanently, and that he would never see him again in any form except portraits he was rarely even allowed to keep near him. I want you to sit with what that moment actually contained. This was a boy who had already lost his father's presence at age 3. Now, at age 10, he lost the possibility of ever recovering it. There was no funeral he was permitted to attend, no body he would see for over a century, no return of ashes in his own lifetime. Grief, for him, arrived second-hand and incomplete, the way almost everything true about his own identity had always arrived. There is a detail here worth planting, because it will not make sense until later in this story. Even after Napoleon's death, the imperial household in Vienna did not soften its surveillance of the boy. And if anything, it tightened. A living Bonaparte heir was dangerous. A dead emperor's 10-year-old son, grieving and impressionable, was, in the eyes of men like Metternich, even more dangerous, because grief made a boy susceptible to exactly the kind of Bonapartist sentiment that kept resurfacing across Europe every time a government wobbled. You have to ask yourself what it does to a child to grieve a man he barely knew in the flesh, inside a household run by people who feared the ghost of that man more than they loved the boy standing in front of them. What happened to that grief, where it went, and what it eventually cost him would not become fully visible for another several years. But something in the household shifted after 1821. The watching grew closer, the doors locked a little tighter, and the boy grew a little more determined, in private, to become exactly what everyone around him feared he might become. Here is what no popular account of this family has ever fully explained. The years between his father's death and his own late teens were not a quiet decline. They were a slow, deliberate act of self-construction, carried out almost entirely behind closed doors. By the time he was old enough to enter military training, he became a cadet in the Austrian army at the age of 12, in 1823. His tutors described him as intelligent, serious, and unusually focused, particularly on anything to do with warfare. He grew tall for his age, eventually reaching nearly 6 feet by 17. Marshal Marmont and Count Dietrichstein, the two men who observed him most closely, agreed independently on one word for his temperament: warlike. That word alone should have been a compliment for an Austrian officer's son. For this particular boy, it was treated instead as a diagnosis, a danger sign, something to be managed rather than encouraged. And so his household managed him, carefully, coldly, and at times cruelly. This is the parallel inner world that almost no popular telling of his life fully accounts for. A young man privately absorbing every scrap of his father's legend he could find, while the machinery around him actively worked to keep that legend from ever translating into real power. Metternich, by his own aide's later account, spoke to the young Duke directly only about 5 times across 17 years. Not out of indifference, out of what one biographer described as something closer to revulsion. The resemblance to the Corsican in the boy's own face reportedly offended the Chancellor like an insult. At one court reception on the young man's 18th birthday, Metternich paid the required compliments and left the palace as quickly as he could without causing a scene. This was the household the boy grew up inside, a grandfather who loved him personally, and a state apparatus around that grandfather that treated his very face as a kind of threat. The effect on him was not invisible to the people closest to him, even if it stayed hidden from the wider public. He grew resentful of the Austrian relatives who claimed to love him while blocking every path back to the country and the name he had been born into. He began surrounding himself, where he could, with French courtiers and French sympathizers rather than Austrian ones, and in a detail few outside dedicated Napoleonic scholarship know well, he grew estranged from his own mother, not simply from distance, but from what he learned about her. When he discovered that Louise had borne children to her lover Neipperg even before Napoleon's death, he said something that cut cleanly to the heart of everything he had lost. If Josephine had been his mother, he said, his father would not be buried on St. Helena, and he would not be sitting here in Vienna at all. If the first loss was his father's death, the second was something quieter and, in its own way, crueler, the collapse, in real time, of the one door that might have led him back to power. In July of 1830, revolution broke out in Paris. King Charles X, the Bourbon monarch, who had never had any patience for Bonapartist sentiment, was overthrown in 3 days of street fighting. For a brief window, Bonapartist sympathizers across France believed the moment had finally arrived, that the son of the emperor, now 19 years old, tall, trained, and undeniably his father's child in bearing, if not in name, might finally be recalled from Vienna to take the throne that had, on paper, always technically been his. This was not the first time the ground had shifted under a member of this family, but it was different in one important way. This time, the boy himself was old enough and aware enough to understand exactly what was slipping away as it happened, in real time, from inside the very palace that was keeping him from acting on it. The public reaction in France was, in places, genuinely fervent. Crowds in Paris were recorded chanting for Napoleon II alongside Republican slogans, treating the absent Duke of Reichstadt as a living symbol of everything the restored monarchy had failed to deliver. The private reaction inside the Viennese court was almost the opposite: cautious, calculating, and ultimately paralyzing. Metternich, ever the pragmatist, appeared for a moment to entertain the idea of using the boy as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the new French government, floating his name the way a card player might show, then withdraw, a single high card. But when pressed to actually release the young man to return to French soil, under his own colours, Metternich blocked it outright. The reasoning, preserved in Austrian correspondence from the period, was chillingly explicit. A Bonaparte restoration in France, or worse, in a unified Italy where his honorific title of King of Rome still carried real symbolic weight, was simply incompatible with the stability the great powers had spent 15 years building since Waterloo. The very qualities that made him useful as a threat, his bloodline, his bearing, his obvious resemblance to his father, were exactly why he could never be allowed to act on any of it. So the door that had cracked open in the summer of 1830 closed again by the autumn, without the young man ever setting foot outside Austrian territory. And there was a second, quieter reason nobody in the court wanted to discuss too loudly that year. His health, already fragile, had begun visibly declining. He made a decision, around this time, that his tutors and doctors both later regretted. He began pushing his body harder than it could bear, riding, drilling, and training as though he could outmarch the illness closing in on his chest. Nobody around him called it what it was yet, but the retreat from politics in 1830 was not only political, it was also the beginning of the retreat from his own body. The scandal in this young man's life was never a single headline. It was something slower and, in its way, more revealing. The quiet public unravelling of the fantasy that Austria was raising him with any genuine warmth at all. The trigger, when it finally surfaced, was almost embarrassingly small in scale compared to everything else this story carries. A locked drawer. In 1831, 20 years old, and finally permitted a taste of the ordinary social life of a young Austrian officer, he met a dark-haired young woman named Naundine Carolli at a masquerade ball and began exchanging letters with her, dodging what he and everyone around him understood to be Metternich's network of watchers. His governor, Count Dietrichstein, eventually discovered the correspondence, forced open the drawer where the letters were kept, and confronted him directly in front of witnesses. "You have a love affair?" Dietrichstein demanded, according to accounts from the period. "Yes," the young Duke answered, coolly. "You can see with whom. It is a small scene, but it is also, in miniature, the entire architecture of his life. A grown man, a serving military officer, still subject to his desk being searched like a schoolboy's, his private correspondence treated as a state security matter rather than a young man's private affair. The press and the public, when word of the surveillance around him circulated at all, reacted with a mixture of pity and fascination that mirrored the way Europe had always regarded him, less as a person than as a symbol whose every private detail carried political weight. He was, one contemporary account noted, surrounded by admirers of all ages who found him irresistible, tall, dashing, unmistakably his father's son in bearing. And yet underneath, the admiration was always the same watchfulness that had followed him since childhood. What the gossip about a locked drawer and a masquerade ball romance obscured, what it was, in a sense, designed to obscure, was the real secret of his life. It was never really about a girl, or a letter, or even about restoration politics. The real secret, the thing his own household worked hardest to keep buried, was simpler and sadder, that the son of Napoleon Bonaparte had been raised, deliberately, to become someone who could never be Napoleon Bonaparte's son in any way that mattered, not in name, not in nationality, not, in the end, even in the freedom to choose whom he loved without a governor searching his furniture. His family, meaning by now his Austrian family, since his French one was scattered and largely forbidden to him, did not rally around him in this moment. Francis, his grandfather, remained fond but distant. Metternich remained watchful and cold, and the young man, increasingly ill, increasingly isolated, kept doing the one thing nobody could take from him: training, riding, and pushing himself toward a military career that his own body was already failing to support. There was no dramatic flight into exile for this young man, because he had been living in exile, quietly, his entire life, a captive audience of one inside his own grandfather's palace. What changed, in the last 2 years of his life, was not geography. It was the final, irreversible withdrawal of his body from the future everyone still half expected him to have. By 1830, promoted through the Austrian ranks to major and then to lieutenant colonel, he was finally given something close to a genuine command. On the 16th of June, 1831, he took charge of an Austrian battalion of 200 men. For a young man who had spent his whole life dressing up in a miniature version of his father's uniform, this was as close as reality would ever let him come to the destiny stitched into that childhood costume. His doctor, a Viennese physician named Malfatti, visited him shortly after this promotion and found an exhausted officer pushing himself far past what his weakening chest could sustain. Malfatti ordered rest. The young Duke refused to take it seriously. He drilled anyway. He rode anyway. Within months his fever returned, his lungs inflamed, and Malfatti confined him to 2 full months of bed rest. A temporary fix that bought him time, not health. By January of 1832, the fever was back, and this time even the ordinarily optimistic Malfatti recognized the shape of what he was looking at. Consumption, tuberculosis, the same disease that would, within the century, kill a significant share of Europe's aristocracy and its poor alike, indiscriminate in a way his own bloodline had never been. Here, finally, one of the 3 details planted at the very start of this video comes due. Remember the locked drawer from 1831? The letters from Nondine Caroli, confiscated by his own governor. That romance, cut short by discovery, was among the last ordinary pleasures this young man was permitted before his world narrowed entirely to sick rooms and physicians. He never saw the relationship allowed to develop naturally. Instead, in mid-April of 1832, still trying to maintain some version of a normal life, he took a long morning ride into cold, damp weather. That evening, at the Prater, a wheel of his carriage broke. He tried to walk home. His strength gave out, and he collapsed in the street. The following day, he came down with pneumonia, layered on top of the tuberculosis, already destroying his lungs. His grandfather, hoping to lift the young man's spirits, made him colonel of the 60th Imperial Regiment of Infantry. The gesture came too late for even simple gratitude. Franz was too weak to write and thank him. On the 22nd of May, 1832, he was moved to Schönbrunn Palace, for what everyone around him now understood, without saying so directly, was not recovery. It was the beginning of the end. If there is a single figure whose presence shaped, distorted, and ultimately defined this young man's entire life more than any other, more, arguably, than either of his own parents, it is Klemens von Metternich, the Austrian Chancellor of State. Born in Koblenz in 1773, Metternich had spent decades constructing exactly the kind of European stability that a living, adult, popular son of Napoleon Bonaparte threatened to unravel overnight. He had been Austria's ambassador to Napoleonic France itself, had watched Napoleon up close for years, had even, by his own later admission, found something to privately admire in the man he ultimately helped defeat. But admiration for the father did nothing to soften his handling of the son. If anything, the resemblance made it worse. What Metternich gave this young man was, in effect, survival. A roof, an education, a title, a life lived in relative comfort and physical safety, rather than the exile or imprisonment that might have befallen a less carefully managed royal hostage. What Metternich cost him was almost everything else. His name, his nationality, his correspondence with his own grandmother, his freedom to be used politically only on Austrian terms and never his own, and, according to at least one account, quite possibly, his final chance at survival itself. When the young Duke's health was failing and doctors suggested a warmer climate, a winter in Naples perhaps, where the sea air might have done for his lungs what Vienna's damp cold could not, it was reportedly Metternich who blocked the request. There is a documented account, preserved by the young Duke's own aide, Anton von Prokesch-Osten, that captures the emotional core of this relationship better than any policy memo could. Metternich spoke to the Duke of Reichstadt directly only about 5 times across 17 years of guardianship. 5 conversations, in 17 years, with the young man whose entire life he controlled from a careful distance. At a court reception on the Duke's 18th birthday, witnesses recalled Metternich delivering only the required compliments before leaving the palace as quickly as etiquette allowed, visibly unable to bear a resemblance he found, in the words of one biographer's account, like an insult stamped onto a young man's face. What did the young Duke himself think of the man who had shaped nearly every hour of his adult life? He is reported to have understood exactly what Metternich represented, and to have hated him for it. Quietly, the way a man learns to hate someone he cannot ever openly oppose. He recognized the icy courtesy for what it was, and by the final months of his illness, when it no longer mattered whether Metternich approved of him or not, that hostility had curdled into something closer to indifference, the exhaustion of a young man too sick to spend what little strength remained on old grievances. This young man never had children of his own. He died at 21, unmarried, without issue, the direct Bonaparte imperial line ending with him in the eyes of French law. So the accounting here runs differently than it might for a man who lived to raise a family of his own. Instead, the cost is generational in a different direction. What this one child inherited from the choices, wars, and appetites of the parents who made him, and what he in turn was denied the chance to pass on to anyone at all. From his father, he inherited a name that opened no doors in the country where he actually lived, and every door in a country he was never again permitted to set foot in. He inherited a legend he had to smuggle into his own life through a library shelf and a childhood costume, because the men raising him considered that legend too dangerous to hand him directly. From his mother, he inherited something colder still, a template for how easily a Bonaparte could be set aside once political convenience demanded it. Marie-Louise, who had once been persuaded that abandoning her husband was the practical, sensible choice, extended much the same practical distance to her son, visiting rarely, remarrying, and raising an entirely separate family in Parma, present again only at the very end, when there was nothing left to do but watch him die. The pattern here is worth naming plainly. Napoleon himself had grown up the second son of a family of modest Corsican gentry, watching his own father Carlo switch allegiances from Corsican independence to French collaboration purely out of pragmatic necessity, a lesson in flexible loyalty that shaped Napoleon's entire rise. His son inherited a version of that same lesson, except this time it was Napoleon's own body that vanished from his life at the moment of political necessity, exiled first to Elba and then to St. Helena, and it was the boy himself, rather than a father, who was left to reconcile ambition with survival, except he was never given the ambition's tools, only its inheritance of danger. Remember the second of our 3 opening teasers, the portrait Metternich could not bear to look at. That detail belongs here, in this accounting, because it captures something essential about what this child actually paid. He did not simply lose a father, a title, a nation, and eventually his health. He lost the ability to ever be seen as anything other than a resemblance, a living reminder of somebody else's war, somebody else's glory, somebody else's downfall. Even the people who loved him, like his grandfather Francis, loved him partly as a proxy for the peace Francis had helped negotiate. Even the people who feared him, like Metternich, feared not him, but the ghost standing behind his shoulder. He was, in the end, the only member of this family who paid the full price of the Napoleonic legend without ever once getting to spend a single day of the power that legend was supposed to buy. By the early months of 1832, the decline had a name doctors were no longer willing to soften: consumption in its advanced stages. Compounding a case of pneumonia his body had never fully recovered from since the fall in the street outside the Prater. There is no financial ruin to recount here, no fortune squandered. Franz had lived, materially, in comfort his entire life, housed in imperial palaces, dressed in the uniforms of an Austrian officer corps that had absorbed him fully into its ranks. The collapse in this story is not economic. It is entirely physical, and it unfolds with a specificity the historical record preserves almost minute by minute, because the household around him understood, finally, that they were documenting the end of a story Europe had been watching for 2 decades. He was moved to Schönbrunn Palace on the 22nd of May, 1832, ostensibly for the fresher air surrounding the grounds. His mother, Marie-Louise, was summoned from her duchy in Parma and arrived to find a son already unrecognizable from the tall, vigorous young officer she had last properly seen. Reduced, in the words of one account, written from the household's own record, to skin and bone, his once 6-foot frame collapsing in on itself as tuberculosis destroyed first one lung and then crept toward the other. His grandfather, Emperor Francis, visited when his own duties in Vienna allowed. His voice, by this point, had grown hoarse. The disease had begun affecting his larynx as well as his lungs. His legs, drained of colour, swelled with fluid his failing body could no longer process. He had, by midsummer, lost hearing in his left ear entirely, one more small function abandoning him alongside all the larger ones. The object he would not give up, even now, was the same one that had defined him since childhood, the identity of a soldier. Even confined to bed, even as his own doctors abandoned hope, he continued to think and speak in the language of military duty and discipline, the same instinct that had led him to override Malfatti's orders to rest a full year earlier, the same instinct that had, in some very real sense, hastened the decline now killing him. He had spent his entire short life trying to outmarch an inheritance that both required him to be his father's son and forbade him from ever fully becoming him. In the end, his body simply ran out of road on which to keep marching. By July 19th, the symptoms of the final stage of the disease had fully manifested. The physicians, this time including even the optimistic Malfatti, formally gave up hope of saving him. From that date forward, everyone around him, his mother, his household, the palace staff who had watched him grow from a child dressing in a miniature uniform to a dying young colonel, understood they were simply waiting. He spent his last conscious days inside a bedroom at Schönbrunn Palace, the same palace where, as a boy, he had first begun secretly reading his father's memoirs and drilling imaginary soldiers down the corridors. The window of that room looked out over the same gardens where, twice daily as a small child, he had once been carried for air. By mid-July of 1832, even a single trip to those gardens required what witnesses described as the most emphatic persuasion. From the 19th of July onward, he refused all food. On the 21st, breathing itself had become an act of agony. "I desire death," he told those around him. "Only death." His mother visited him during the day, when she could bear to. His grandfather, occupied with the business of the Austrian state even now, was not present in the room at the very end. On the morning of the 22nd of July, at around 5 o'clock, his physicians Malfatti and Moll approached the bed together. Malfatti smoothed the lines from the young man's forehead and murmured to his colleague that the warmth of life had already gone out of him. Louise, standing nearby, caught the half-whispered words. She tried to rise and collapsed back to her knees, too weak and shaken to stand on her own. Two attendants, Hartmann and Marshall, had to help her from the room, past candles that had burned all through the night and were still lit in the full daylight of morning. His actual final words, according to the account preserved by Baron Moll, were not the poetic sentence most often quoted in his honour. As the moment of death arrived, he clutched convulsively at his physician's arm with one hand, beat at his own chest with the other, and forced out two words with tremendous effort: poultices, blisters, a dying man's last instinctive reach for a remedy that could no longer help him. Then his eyes fixed and glazed, his body's convulsions relaxed, and he fell into the stillness that preceded death. But there is another sentence, spoken in the days before that final morning, that history has chosen to remember as his true epitaph, and it deserves to be heard in full, because he composed it himself, with full awareness of exactly what his life had and had not been. My birth and my death, that is my whole story. In the fuller French original he is recorded as adding, "Between my cradle and my grave, there is a great zero." The room where he died still held, somewhere among his belongings, small, physical traces of the identity Vienna had spent 21 years trying to manage out of him. Books about his father, a portrait or two that had survived the household's careful curation, the remnants of a childhood spent playing at being a soldier in his father's image. Grief-stricken members of the court crowded into the death chamber almost immediately, cutting locks of his hair, gathering whatever keepsakes they could find, the way mourners across Europe had done for his father, 11 years earlier, on a rock in the South Atlantic. The post-mortem examination, conducted the following day by 6 attending physicians, confirmed what everyone in that final week had already understood, without needing a medical vocabulary for it. His left lung was only lightly affected, but his right lung had been almost entirely destroyed by tuberculosis. He was buried in the Habsburg tradition of his mother's family, not the tradition of his father's empire, interred in the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt beneath Vienna's Capuchin church. His heart placed separately in the Habsburg Herzgruft, the traditional resting place for royal hearts of that dynasty. There was no place in that arrangement, not even in death, for the emperor whose name he carried. His grandfather Francis, devastated by the loss, composed an epitaph describing a son of Napoleon, Emperor of the French, and Maria Louisa, Archduchess of Austria, noting his height, his bearing, his charm, everything about the young man's physical presence, in language that reads now like a monument built for a symbol rather than a full accounting of a life. The estate he left behind was modest by dynastic standards, since he had never held genuine political power or independent wealth of his own. His existence had been sustained entirely at the pleasure of the Austrian court since the age of 3. There was no fortune to disperse, no palace of his own to demolish or preserve, because he had never truly possessed one. What he left instead was a legend, and legends, unlike fortunes, do not stay buried on schedule. Here is the final teaser from the opening of this video, paid off in full. The miniature uniform, sewn to resemble his father's, that he wore as a boy, drilling imaginary troops through the corridors of Schönbrunn. That image, preserved in memoirs and later paintings, became one of the defining visual symbols of his entire life story, reproduced in portraits, engravings, and eventually the popular imagination of 19th century Europe, which came to know him by the nickname L'Aiglon, the Eaglet, a title coined years after his death, in poems written by Victor Hugo in 1852, drawing directly on his father's own symbol, the eagle. The most devastating detail of the aftermath did not surface until more than a century later. On the 15th of December 1940, in the middle of the Second World War, with France under Nazi occupation, Adolf Hitler personally ordered the young man's remains transferred from the imperial crypt in Vienna to the Dome of Les Invalides in Paris, to lie at last beside the father he had spent his entire short life trying, and failing, to reach. The date was chosen with calculated precision. It fell exactly 100 years after Napoleon's own remains had been returned to French soil in the original Retour des Cendres of 1840. A gesture of propaganda, dressed as an act of filial reunion, delivered by the one regime in Europe most eager to borrow Napoleonic imagery for its own purposes. He had reached his father's side at last. It had taken 108 years, and a dictator's calculated theatre to get him there. For most of the 19th century, the popular memory of this young man settled into a single, simplified shape: the tragic prince, the doomed eaglet, a romantic footnote whose sole function in history was to illustrate how completely his father's empire had collapsed. Edmond Rostand's celebrated 1899 play, L'Aiglon, cemented this image for a mass audience, casting him as a wistful, poetic dreamer, undone by forces entirely outside his control. A beautiful tragedy, told mostly for its beauty. What that romantic framing consistently underplayed, and what more careful biographical work, particularly Edward de Wertheimer's early 20th century study drawing on newly available Austrian court correspondence, eventually brought into sharper focus, is something less poetic and more damning. This was not simply an unlucky young man undone by fate or fragile lungs. This was a documented, deliberate policy of containment, carried out over 17 years by one of the most capable statesmen in European history, applied to a child who had committed no crime beyond being born to the wrong father at the wrong historical moment. He was not, as some contemporary Austrian commentary occasionally implied, simply a delicate or overindulged young aristocrat whose own recklessness with his health brought about his early death. The clinical reappraisal, drawing on the detailed medical accounts preserved by his physicians, points instead to a young man born into and raised inside conditions of chronic surveillance and psychological confinement that would have strained any constitution. A young man whose own doctors explicitly identified his refusal to rest, his insistence on pushing his ailing body through military drills, as a symptom of something deeper than simple vanity, a desperate, almost compulsive need to prove himself the equal of a father he had been forbidden from ever truly knowing. The most heartbreaking detail to emerge from later scholarship is not a single sealed document or dramatic revelation, but something quieter. The record of just 5 documented conversations between Metternich and the young Duke across an entire 17-year guardianship. 5 conversations. In the correspondence and memoirs of the people who actually surrounded him, Marmon, Dietrichstein, Prokesh Osten, a consistent picture emerges of a young man who was never once treated by the men who controlled his fate as anything other than a problem to be managed, a resemblance to be endured, a name to be quietly replaced. What the Austrian court called prudent state security was, in fact, something closer to a slow, methodical erasure of a living person's autonomy in service of a peace treaty. And what 19th-century popular romance called a poet's tragic prince was, underneath the verse, simply a young man who spent every day of his short adult life understanding exactly what had been done to him and having no power whatsoever to change it. This is not a story about a beautiful, doomed dreamer. It is a story about a country that built a gilded prison for a boy it was too afraid to either free or destroy outright, and called the result mercy. Return, now, to that bedroom at Schönbrunn on the morning of the 22nd of July, 1832. The candles are still burning, even though daylight has already filled the room. Marie-Louise is being helped from the chamber, too weak to stand on her own. The physicians are exchanging quiet words over a body that has finally stopped fighting for air. Remember the miniature uniform from the beginning of this video, the small, carefully tailored replica of his father's military dress that a child once wore, drilling imaginary soldiers through these very corridors, decades before this same room became his deathbed. That uniform was never really about play. It was the first and most honest attempt this young man ever made to reach across the gap between who he had been born to be and who the world around him would actually permit him to become. He spent every year between that childhood costume and this final morning trying, in one form or another, to close that same gap, through secret reading, through military service, through a body he drove past its limits, because obedience to a name was the only inheritance nobody could confiscate from him. How does the son of the most powerful man Europe had seen in 1,000 years end up dying, forgotten by the government that raised him, in a borrowed name, inside a palace belonging to the family that had defeated his father twice? He does not end up there through any single villain or any single tragic accident. He ends up there because an entire continent decided, quietly and almost unanimously, that the safest thing to do with a dangerous inheritance was to keep it alive just enough to control, and never enough to let it live freely. What Napoleon Bonaparte built was an empire that reshaped the map, the law, and the self-image of an entire continent. What that empire cost, in its final and most intimate accounting, was a son who never once got to choose his own name, his own nation, his own future, or even, in the end, the pace of his own decline. A son whose entire existence, from the cannon salute at his birth to the calculated propaganda of his reburial in 1940, was conducted for the benefit of other people's politics. He himself put the final cost better than any historian since has managed to improve on. Between his cradle and his grave, he said, there was a great zero. That is not a metaphor. It is an inventory. If you know something about the Duke of Reichstadt that this story did not reach, write it below.